people have been talking more and more about what they call the Mandela effect. This effect was coined by someone in 2009 who realized that she had false memories about Nelson Mandela, was certain that he had died in prison. And although he never died in prison, obviously he left prison and became the president. And so she coined it the Mandela effect. And what it is really is that we realize that many people, not just us, have false memories of certain details of the world. And that for some reason, we all have the same false memory. Some famous examples, of course, include the Monopoly Man, who people remember having a monocle, although he doesn't have a monocle. There's the Fruit of the Loom logo that is a bunch of fruits together, but people remember having a cornucopia behind the fruits. And the other one that's quite famous is the Berenstain Bears, and how the Berenstain Bears, people think that Berenstein is written at the end with the E-I-N, where in fact it's Berenstein with A-I-N at the end, and everybody kind of remembers. And it's funny because I myself, when I started to learn about this, realized that I also remembered things in the way that the Mandela effect remembered them. That is, I had Berenstain Bears books when I was young, and I always thought that it was written E-I-N. I always, if you ask me, is there a cornucopia in the Fruit of the Loom logo, I would have told you yes. And the same with the Monopoly Man. Now, what's interesting is that there, of course, have been the wildest theories about the Mandela effect, one of which is the idea of a glitch in the matrix, the idea that we live in a simulation and that there's mistakes in the simulation. And for that reason, things change and you don't realize, and then somehow what people remember and the actual reality of the world are not the same. People talk about how, maybe it's time traveling, some kind of time travel thing that changed the past or something like that. And, some kind of wild science fiction like explanation for it. But, of course, psychologists explain this in the more reasonable manner, which is that the way that we remember things, the manner by which we tend to remember is a kind of compression agent. Our mind likes to remember things in a certain way, things that make more sense in a kind of narrative fashion, a way that is easier to remember and also gets fused with other memories together, including, for example, people commenting on it, people parodying it later. So the famous example, of course, of Darth Vader, who in The Empire Strikes Back, we remember him saying, "Luke, I am your father," when in fact he doesn't say that. He says, "No, I am your father." Now, what the psychologist will say is that, there's a contraction. You remember "Luke, I am your father" rather than "No, I am your father," because "No, I am your father," if you isolate it, it doesn't hold. It doesn't have the narrative strength of saying the name of the person, because the "no" it makes it a little segment in a conversation. Whereas when you say "Luke, I am your father," then all of a sudden it has a kind of completeness to it that makes it easier to remember. And the same for all the other ones. For example, if you think of the Monopoly Man having a monocle just conforms to ideas of a kind of 19th century fop, elite rich man. For example, the Planters peanut logo has a monocle and it also has a top hat and a cane in a similar way as the Monopoly Man. And so these images get fused, and then when you recall something, they kind of get fused together. Now, of course, I think this is a much better explanation, but what's missing in the psychologist's explanation is, of course, what we could call the symbolic take, the symbolic approach. And this is the one that I want to kind of delve into with you right now. I have talked about this several times, which is the way that legends accumulate around characters, the way that legends accumulate around important characters, and how the way we remember things tends to snap to the pattern is the way that I talk about it, which is that one of the things the psychologists don't necessarily dive into is why is it that certain images are easier to remember? Why is it that certain images will be the ones that we tend to move towards? How is it that the specific element of something gets connected to a bigger image that contains the lower elements? And so, for example, if you think of the image or the kind of image of a 19th century elite man. This is a mythological image in our culture. It's kind of like a cowboy, is a mythological image in our culture. And there are others, let's say a gangster would be another one. There are many contemporary mythological figures. Is the process by which, when we remember things or we hear stories, we tend to want to snap them to a more encompassing or let's say more mythologically accurate story. There is a kind of satisfaction that we search for when we remember things, and some things are not. They don't have that nugget that will make it memorable. And so if you do that over iterations and iterations, you can imagine why stories would become more and more mythological with time. How the way to remember something, and it's very practical. The mistake that we make when we think of the Mandela effect is that in some ways we maybe see it as something that is a problem or something that is a kind of weakness of the human psyche. But if you take it from a symbolic perspective, it's actually the very opposite. This is in some ways the strength of human psyche, is to remember patterns and to want to stick things to the greater pattern so that you have this sense that the world is meaningful and that the world has coherence. The truth is that if you go into the details of any image, that is memorable, you'll find that there are differences in every one. This might sound ridiculous, but it's like if you print two versions of the Fruit of the Loom logo, there will be differences between the fruit of one and the other, right? One, the color might be a little off. The other one, the color might be a little more saturated. Maybe the line is not as thick, and they're different versions because designers will create different ones. And so if you look at every single Fruit of the Loom logo that's ever existed, you'll see that it's changed. Maybe they've changed some of the fruits. Maybe they've adapted a few things, made it simpler, more complex, whatever, but we just remember the logo. And that is completely normal. And that that's completely normal, else you couldn't function in the world, because you wouldn't be able to see, you wouldn't be able to see that things are the same. You would have one glass and another glass, and you say, well, this glass is different from this one, and you wouldn't be able to notice that they're the same glass. So the process by which we are able to kind of fuse things together in higher patterns is a completely natural thing to do, and something that we do all the time. And the fact that someone is shocked because they look at the Fruit of the Loom logo and they realize that they remembered it with a cornucopia, realize that you do this all the time at more minute levels. It's just that now it's kind of happening at a level that I can easily point to, and most people, because of their level of attention, are able to differentiate the logos. When I was young, I studied stamp collecting with my uncle, who was like a world-class stamp collector. And my uncle, what he was trying to help me do was to notice the most minute differences between stamps. And so we were learning colors that were so subtle that most people can't see the difference between them. But they do exist if you move down into levels of attention that are more precise. And you're able to notice difference at very, very subtle levels if you train yourself to do that. But imagine that this process by which we're able to either distinguish or not distinguish difference happens at every single level of reality. And so your mind says the Fruit of the Loom logo is in the same category as the cornucopia, and therefore joins it together so that you see it as the same, in the same way that you can look at two stamps and you see them as the same, but an expert at stamp collecting is able to make the minute differences. Okay, so this is something that is actually very useful for the human person to do. And it's something that we shouldn't think that it's necessarily a mistake. It can be a mistake when it causes problems. The way that we remember things and the way that we, let's say, carry them forward is always based on purpose. And so, if there was some reason in your life to differentiate the Fruit of the Loom logo from a cornucopia, then that would be useful for you to be able to tell the difference, and it's the same. Like if you if you, for some reason, had to differentiate the Monopoly Man from the Planters logo, then then you would be able to tell the difference. And if you point to it, then people will see the difference. But until you point to it and you say, look at this and how different it is, your mind does what it does and will connect things together in patterns in a way that is more related to a kind of coherence of the world and maintaining a coherence of the world. And so, what's fascinating about that is when people talk about, this idea that this would be a kind of proof for simulation theory. Simulation theory is really a large mistake. The reason why it's a mistake is that there is no baseline reality. That doesn't mean anything. The idea that there would be some kind of baseline reality that doesn't have layers of representation on top of them is ridiculous. That doesn't exist. All levels of reality that we can encounter through consciousness have layers of representation in the sense that they have a need for analogy and of connecting things together and functioning in patterns. And therefore, the way that people, of course, perceive certain things that would lead them to believing in this idea of levels of simulation, they're usually just the way that consciousness functions. And they're usually related to just how language, condenses and how patterns of image making condenses reality together towards patterns. You don't have to imagine a science fiction, like huge science fiction version of like aliens that created a simulation, and we live inside a simulation, and that maybe there are different, there are levels and levels of simulations. What that type of theory is pointing to is actually the layers and layers of pattern making that exist in the world. Now, whether or not we live in some kind of simulation, it's kind of like in the Matrix. It doesn't really matter. Like whether or not there would have been some alien race in the past that have created a simulation in which we live, some very, very powerful technological, these kinds of questions are so useless, and they don't really help you navigate the world. They don't help you kind of live in the world. But if you kind of understand rather, this idea of a kind of levels of representation and levels of contraction that exist in the world, symbolic contractions, then it's much more useful than the simulation theory. So, a good way of thinking about this is to kind of think of this idea of the hero's journey, the famous Joseph Campbell schema for a story where the hero leaves his home and then goes out on an adventure and then returns to his home. That image of, I tend to contract it even more, it's just procession and return. That is, all stories are procession and return. All stories are leaving a certain state, moving into a state of, or being challenged, or moving into a state of confusion or uncertainty, where the place where you were gets undone, and then something new or some new state is brought about. Now, every story has that pattern. Like every single one, not only every single story, every single sentence, every single breath that you take, it's basically like the structure of reality. It's a metaphysical structure of moving from the one into the many, and then from the many into the one. It's the cosmic principle. And so the thing is that every single thing is a version of that, and every single thing will tend to click towards that. And then there are instantiations of different levels of that and different types of that, different versions of that at lower levels of representation as we look at the world. And those versions, like the different types of instantiations of that, are usually related to particular circumstances, related to particular purposes. And that is completely fine. But it's also okay to kind of see all of these as a version of the higher one. And so now what does this have to do with the Mandela effect? Now it's the same. So the way in which, for example, ancient cultures came to the image of the cornucopia, very intuitively, is kind of like the way that ancient people came to the image of fairy tales. That is, there's a kind of snapping to a pattern. There's something about the relationship, and it's intuitive. We don't totally can even know rationally what it is. There's something about the idea of a horn and fruit that are coming out of that horn that is related to the point of the horn, right? Opening up into many, and the seed, becoming the fruit, the one becoming the many. There's a kind of very powerful ontological pattern that the cornucopia captured, right? From there to there. And so then if you create underwear, especially underwear for boys, that is related to this image of fruit of the loom, fruit of the body, you could say, that is bringing about an image of fertility, an image of how the seed becomes the fruit, and you wear it around your waist. There's a kind of very deep fertility image in terms of what fruit of the loom means. All of that comes together, and then we'll connect the logo of the company to the mythological image. And it's completely normal that you connect it to the mythological image, because the mythological image, the way it was arrived at was through this kind of, this ontological pruning. That is, we don't even know how that image came about, but after centuries of it kind of refining itself and existing in our society, it has a very, very deep mythological undertone, right? It captures the reality of the relationship between one and many, between seed and fruit, between fertility and children, and then ultimately in underwear, obviously, between the relationship between underwear and reproduction, fertility, and all that. And it does it in a way, obviously, that's not gross, or that isn't that's not explicitly sexual, but has all of that kind of contained. So it's not surprising that when you engage with this type of imagery, that you would end up connecting with the mythological version of what it is that you're instantiating. And sometimes obviously it's not as deep as the cornucopia. For example, in the Berenstain Bears, it's like we've seen all the names that end in ein, written EIN, all our life. And I've never in my life seen a name that ends AIN. And therefore, if I'm going to remember that, then I'm going to snap it to the pattern more easily. And it's the same with some of the more kind of gross versions of the Mandela effect. But some of them, like I said, the fruit of the loom one, for example, have actually a very kind of deep mythological aspect to them, and that are showing you the way in which, we remember things, and how, first of all, it's not arbitrary, and second of all, it's towards purposes, and third of all, they're at the top of the memory chain, is something that is universal, and is kind of intuiting the deep ontological structure of the world. And so hopefully this was useful on a thought about the Mandela effect.
This has been a Pinguinati production. If you'd like to support the channel, links are in the description.